It's really lovely to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm just going to give a brief introduction to the book before we hear the poems, hear the main event. Um, there is a prose poem in John Ashbery's The Double Dream of Spring that's called For John Clare. I wanted to start with the opening lines of that because they kind of reminded me of some of the themes, some of the kind of discoveries in near life experience in Rowland's second collection. The poem starts, For John Clare, kind of empty in the way it sees everything. The earth gets to its feet and salutes the sky. More of a success at it this time than most others it is. The feeling that the sky might be in the back of someone's mind. There's a playful movement in those lines between the inner life and the world, which is the case, or maybe the case, or maybe said to be the case. There's also the sense of the world watching itself without us that gets, I think, inverted in Rowland's work. It's our ever presence, whatever it is that we're looking at, the landscape, the painting, the day that we're living in, is always filtered through our psyches, ourselves. The world occurs to me is the first line of Rowland's poem Outtakes. And there's this perfectly pitched double meaning throughout the whole collection. Even the title of that poem, Outtakes, places us in something peripheral, rejected from a definitive text because something went wrong and has to be done again. Echoes of phrases and commonplace aphorisms rendered new, something the narrator has just realized as if apropos of nothing. In this case, the world occurs to me, but simultaneously the world is that which happens to us, which acts on us. It's happening to us constantly, within time, out of time, within our strange relationship to time, that being a major theme of the book, and which I'm still drawing out as I reread it, which I've done more than a couple of times. And some of the poems in this book were familiar to me from working on Rowland with his doctoral thesis, and some of them were completely new to me when the book came out, which was a joy to discover as well. Rowland's debut, which you likely have read and be familiar with, A Few Interiors, is a wonderful collection, and it made me laugh frequently, more or less every poem, which is part of the joy of it as a collection. There's, as you'll know, a kind of Ashberyan wit to Rowland's work, a skewering of pomposity and faux profundity, which I found both exciting and enviable. But it's also, as a book possessed of that critical humility, the pomposity that's skewered is usually belonging to the speaker or the characters within the poems, as they or we rage against absurd indignities concocted by the pocket universe of the poem. Near life experience at first seems like something more melancholic and quieter than A Few Interiors, albeit with the same wise humor. But this is not so much an early arrival at a late style as it is a hard-won testing out of the poetic territory that Rowland is staking in his work. There's a transfigured wordplay, philosophical conundrum, a quite skillful avoidance of pop cultural detritus in favor of an engagement with something lasting or something that has lasted, the bliss found in language, our place in the landscape, perhaps more than the portrait, an informed and illuminating engagement with visual art, that oneness that O'Hara writes about between the two mediums. And all of this in the work searches and arrests us to search with it, forever en route, as one of the lines from the poem says. I've got so much faith in Rowland's work and in Rowland as a poet, and I know his readers do as well, as will those who are yet to discover it, that near life experience already feels like a significant achievement in a body of work that we're looking back on 50 years into the future. It's a real pleasure to be able to introduce Rowland. I know that you'll enjoy the reading as much as I will, and we'll have some. Rowland and I will bat some questions around, but also please do add questions to the Q&A box below. which I'll be happy to relay and discuss, not improve on, but I'll do my best. Please join me in welcoming Rowland Bagnall. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I know there's a few people here on international time zone, so I'm very grateful for them being here too. I really appreciate it. Luke, thanks so much for being here too and for joining me in this. That's an extremely generous introduction that is quite surreal to hear in some ways. And it's so generous of you to read my work so carefully and thoughtfully. Some of you may know Luke alluded to the fact that Luke and I have been working together for the last few years. I completed a PhD in creative writing at the University of Birmingham, where the majority of these poems were written. And Luke's been such a kind of significant presence in the shaping of this collection. And his mark is all over the poem, so it feels really appropriate for him to be here. Of course, thank you to Carcanet, Michael and John and Andrew and everyone at the team, and particularly to Jazz, who introduced this evening. Jazz does a lot of things behind the scenes at Carcanet, and this is a good opportunity to thank her for everything she's done to bring this book into the world. I'm going to read 9 poems from the collection. I hope they give a good kind of indication of what the book as a whole is like, and also gives you something to read still once I'm done. The poems should pop up on the screen as I read. That's a good example of Jazz pulling the strings, actually. I thought I'd start with the opening poem, Nothing Personal, which I think distills a lot of the themes that surface throughout the collection, particularly ideas of time and the poetry's relationship with the present moment in particular, as well as something Luke's already alluded to, which I'm sure we'll speak about, some idea of how we relate to our own experience and how we fit into that and how the world experiences us back. So this is the opening poem. Nothing Personal. The century surges, shuddering on, accelerating in pursuit of some place rumoured up ahead, swallowing dusk after dusk of willful, uninfected time in cold-blooded mouthfuls, growing huger and more disarranged. In the end, isn't the point that this is all meant to relate to us, to tell us, in a broad sense, that the message is about ourselves? Instead, maybe the message is that we are understood by them, giving us a meaning at the time we most require it. Still, like the inhabitants of a city soon to be razed by a unit of cavalry, know that this is happening in spite of, not because of you. The mountains are silent, though they speak to each other, the gold air thin at the top of them, a flowering peak, from which point can be seen a valley of arrivals and departures, smouldering campsites, a bend in the river, livestock and settlements, not an inch of land unclaimed. The next 2 poems, I think are kind of connected. They're interested in some idea of the imagination and the role it plays both in our experience of the concrete material world and the process of creating something. I've always been drawn to poets that seem to do some of their thinking or working out in the process of writing a poem, and the poem in that sense can become a record of the process of writing it. So I'm interested in that too, and I think this poem, Landscape Unevenness, has something to do with that. Landscape Unevenness. In spring, when rain that fell some days ago has all but evaporated, becoming purposeful humidity, the ground gives slightly into you, your feet meeting the half-resistance, a landscape unevenness. Usually this has no impact. is largely ignorable unless your movement makes it happen, where it equals everything and everything that comes to mind, each step bringing about the trees, engendering clouds. Today produced a single muntjac, or so it appeared, initiated by a slip, the color of raw clay, emitting centuries of heat, millennia even, like watching myself crash away through the brush. The following poem's called The Shore Season. And as I mentioned, I think it has something in common, to me at least, with the previous poem. Seems to be a poem about beliefs and how they're formed and how they get revised through experience. And maybe that is to do with the kind of idea of being sure or unsure of things. It's also a poem that owes a debt to the American poet Douglas Crace, who I was reading a lot at the time of writing this poem, and whose collection, The Revisionist, also published by Carcanet, incidentally, is never too far from my desk. So this is The Shore Season. This morning we were struck by frost. New crispness, solid underfoot, more blue really than silver. Each leaf and blade of grass held fast, hoping to melt, using the sun to life. It doesn't take a lot to find that everything looks out of place, newly disturbed, unreturnable perhaps to how you remember it. Here lacks the certainty of mountain ranges, wise in their similarity, or the jagged crashing of the coastline, which at least everyone knows is changing. The sea eating the land like acid, the bone grip of the cliffs occasionally loosening, revealing a new shelf of fossils. I used to think that every day the world stayed pretty much the same, but you woke up a little different. For a while, I felt the opposite, that I was me all of the time, and seasons shed the world like skin, proof of their growth, just as volcanoes, tree rings, even dust are proof of something being made. Now I think a blend of these, or quickly change my mind between them so that both appear true at once, like a 19th century illusion where two separate illustrations can be merged by twiddling a string, bird and cage, horse and rider. This reminds me of the first time that I drove home through a snowstorm, early December 2000 and something, snow falling in uneven clumps, accumulation and erasure, the road quietly vanishing, no sign of resistance. The next poem, I've just realized, is also the next poem in the collection, so that's uncanny. It's called Known Unknowns, and so shares with the previous poem a kind of interest in the idea of being certain and uncertain, sure and unsure about the things that you know or feel to be true. It's also about a poem about planting seeds. And so I think is interested in the relationship between the present moment and the future. Known unknowns. Unobserved, I pot these weightless seeds in compost, hurling something at the future, like making it happen. Some are fang-shaped, others orbed, the eyes of tiny fish swimming now blindly out of sight, still living. Is this what you might call a lyric situation? A moment like a giant wave that seems to have predicted you? The difficult thing is to prove what one believes. Insect casings, almonds, grass. Your question, trees. Your answer, also trees. Is this what happened when a child I knew said, music is the night awake, or was this something different? Seed like a basketball, seed like an arrowhead, shower of seeds raining down on a battle, dusting its corpses, sprouting on impact. This is a type of knowledge too, of knowing when to let yourself be planted and watered, like being, though unseen, believed or believed in. Luke mentioned earlier the idea of the world happening to us, and the contrast between ourselves impacting the world and being impacted upon. I think that poem's about that as well. The next two poems are interested in the present moment of experience and to what extent poetry is a useful tool or vehicle for making a record of what happens to us. I'm interested in poetry's ability to do that, but I'm also interested in cartography and map making as another mode of committing the world as it exists in the present moment to paper. I particularly love maps that have somehow outdated themselves or are no longer useful, immediately failing at the thing that they're specifically designed to do because the world has moved on. So this is an atlas, a poem I've always thought that has in the back of its mind Elizabeth Bishop's poem The Map, which I think begins her collection North and South. So this is probably a Bishop-facing poem. An atlas. It's summer around us, a picture we're living in, as though living were a substance that could ease out like a taken breath, the same breath you are taking now, drifting your slow way through lakes of experience, crushing up at last against tomorrow, which is like today. Time happens here in hills and slopes, increments of everything decaying in soft sequences, replaced at once invisibly by sequences ahead, though everything that's seen from here absorbs you like a leaf the sun. Eventually, it's just a case of how long you go on for. Two hands writing side by side down two halves of an empty page, one producing what it sees, the other what it thinks about, reacting in response to sight like blossom flipping from the trees. And so the scene abandons you, the new afternoon now describing itself, its colors and connectedness, the sun proposing no alternative to the way that things are playing out. Faster and faster, believe it or not. Summer, winter, winter, spring. The next poem is called The Hare. There's a lot of great poems that I really admire that consider the poet's encounter with a mysterious or enigmatic animal. I'm thinking of a few, but the Carcanet poet Laura Scott writes very beautifully about hares in particular. So I'm grateful that this poem shares something with her work. You can see the poem on the screen. You'll notice that the majority of lines are indented. That's because they all follow or complete the opening line, I wake into the morning. And when I read this poem, I like to imagine that all of the subsequent lines are taking place simultaneously with each other. Unfortunately, I can't read it like that without some sophisticated recording equipment. So you'll have to imagine that happening. But I like the idea of all the lines being simultaneous. The Hare. I wake into the morning and find unanimous spring, and the windows are pale with filtered light. And the day asks, how shall I survive myself? And read a poem which ends, let it be small enough. And my throat feels dry. And the new rains have defanged the night. And the blackthorn is over, or its blossom is. And the lights burn blue. And imagine a harvest and dry stacks of wheat. And answer my emails in record time. And feel deep currents of understanding. To find a living mosaic, polished and repetitive, smothering the yellow dawn. And the white sky is canoeing south, and have certain phrases in my head, including silent stroboscopic waves. And see ghosts and know that one of them is Robert Frost, and consume a pear from Argentina, and take in the general feel of the place, fading like a set of tracks. And write, I wake into the morning and find unanimous spring, and pass my hand through my own body, and the oceans appear silvery, which is stabbing into months of ice, and think, what kind of poet writes, I wake into the morning and find unanimous spring? And the harvesters are lying down, taking a rest, and its knowable sequence, and it caverns, and it opens like an eyelid, and it stalks us as you stalk a hare. I'm going to read a slightly longer poem. As Luke mentioned, quite a few of the poems in the book are interested in looking at or responding to visual art, and this is one of those poems. It's called Double Vision at the Sink, and I wrote this poem shortly after a trip to New York, staying with a very close friend of mine, a novelist called Charlotte Crow. And on that trip, it must be about 5 years ago now, she took us for the first time to a wing of the Metropolitan Museum where the museum's collections of medieval European art are housed, known as the cloisters, and there's a particular painting in there that appears in this poem. I think this is a poem about layering, which might be clear about from the form of the poem, and trying to get to the bottom of things, trying to scrape back the layers until you find the truth of something. Particularly when objects and animals in the world seem to be trying to communicate to you and trying to get to the essence or the kind of core of something. There's an epigraph at the top of the screen, which is from an earlier kind of version of the poem that seemed to want to hang around, which reads, every time you're looking out, you're really looking in. This is Double Vision at the Sink. Today, I'm looking down into a white ceramic sink, the water running coldly and opaquely from the tap. My task is shelling jumbo shrimp, snapping the carapace away, slipping my index finger in beneath the lightly cracking exoskeleton to peel the interlocking segments of the abdomen apart, the empty casings piling up like shavings from a wooden bowl. I try to think of looking down as looking out into the sky, receding as you reach it as if desperate to get somewhere. Across its face, I see a shimmering man, winking and smiling. I witness his intrusion and acknowledge it, watching his limbs become translucent, ultimately wasting to a single point of greenish light. That afternoon, we'd been up at the cloisters, which I hadn't known was where they keep the so-called marode altarpiece. In it, the Annunciation takes place in a private room, a simple, square domestic space, furnished unassumingly, at least until the objects come to stand for something else, as in the just extinguished candle or the table which has 16 sides. To the right of this is Joseph, drilling holes into a piece of wood. Behind him is a street scene of a European town, outdating him by something close to 1400 years. In the pale base of the sink, I see what looks to be a tapestry. Everything is foreground. The chase, the capture, the imprisonment, the cheeky crowds of onlookers, dressed lavishly, I'd say, even for them. An instantaneous parade of different cloths and coloured silks, intricately woven by the makers of the scene, in which the hunters seem to run as if they had no weight at all. I develop a talent for identifying symbolism, seeing it everywhere in fruits and flowers and hand gestures in photographs, in insects, rodents, and varieties of birds, in the camouflage of reptiles, plane trees, and specific moths, the touch lamp on the bedside table, the heat from the oven, even in the bowl of glossy, naked blue-grey shrimp, which stand for something like fragility or time or the unknowable. Another layer of snow midweek. Another tapestry beneath the first. This one showing the miraculous revival of a man who very nearly died. A woman on the sidelines holds what looks to be a piece of glass. A second figure fades into the lush textural scenery. 3 or 4 days on, I chart the progress of our journey on a small tiltable screen, embedded in the headrest of the window seat in front of me. The screen offers a plane's eye view, allowing me to gaze down on the plane in which we're traveling. The crew switch on the cabin's artificial night, induced by deep fluorescent strips running the whole length of the fuselage. The planet is divided into time zones on a gridded map. I zoom in on the country, then the city we've just left, then the apartment, then the kitchen, where I see myself before the sink, my fingers working neatly on the silvery grey shrimp, the sink's shimmering surface pale, more or less reflecting me, winking and smiling, looking out into the room, like looking down into the opaque non-reflection of the sky. I think that poem's also interested in a tension between kind of third-person omniscient view of things and the kind of first-person lyrical perspective. And I think a lot of the poems in the collection toggle between those two vantage points, and seems a recurring question, which one is a kind of more faithful way of responding to experience. I'm just going to read 2 more poems. The next poem is called Uppsala. It's also a poem about traveling. Also includes a moment of air travel. And this is a poem written shortly after the lifting of various restrictions imposed during the pandemic. And in that sense, I think it's a poem about tentatively re-entering a world that's being closed off from you, trying to work out how you fit into it again after a few months of not being able to. It may help to know that Uppsala is a university town in Sweden, which I visited not so long ago, but I'm not sure that matters to the poem much. Uppsala. Eventually, it's clear that we are always in a kind of transit, forever en route, blinking curiously around at all the suddenness of things we see, whether flying over Norway's coast, unreasonably bright, wide sashes of silver water snaking inland, or driving through the cork trees of a burnt valley in Portugal, the ridge studded with wind turbines. It's strange to think that someone was the first to venture up this way, to follow these steep lines of quartz, feeling the cold through many layers of fur. What must they have thought of it? Why not remain? Perhaps they felt apart, a distance, which happens fairly often now, that things feel at a slight remove, temporarily shut off from you. The question, badly put, is how to figure out a route back in, to readjust to your surroundings like recalling a lost memory. I, for example, used to feed the same horse at the far edge of a bumpy field, and remember its eyes and the star on its nose, though not, surprisingly, its name, or whether there were any others. Sometimes you can only hope to get to know what's there before you speed off in a new direction, past the churches and whatever else, the river and the river's movement. Finally, I'll end with a poem called Freighter before Luke comes back and he and I have a bit of a chat and answer some questions. This poem is a little bit about writing poems. It seems to be set on the coast, and I think coasts are an important location for some of the writing that I've done in this book and elsewhere. I'm interested in places where two different substances kind of meet each other and collide. This also seemed a good poem to end on, and maybe kind of draws together some of the things that have appeared in the poems that I've already read. This is Freighter. How much can it take? The level evening and its center like a season-shifting gear. Hardly any time has passed. Is it just me, or is it just me that's getting this? The bait and switch of the dying light, the unfinished business of the waves, the feeling something's missing, and I mean really missing. On the mainland, now radiating some of its great strength, granite, breccia, hornblende schist, best understood in motion, you can feel the tilting of the earth. A few miles down the coast, a town has lost its people, proving nothing, or nothing yet. Can you hear the susurration of the headland? See the insanely circular movement of the gulls? And this is what the poem is like. The shape of a room and the objects in it scattering like fish, arriving into somewhere else, dragooning us along with it, a pendulum distributing its weight, like sailing into secret waters, different when remembered, and disembarking nimbly, somehow here and now refreshed. Thanks everybody for listening and for coming. That's it. Hey, Luke.
Thank you for a hypnotizingly great reading. Thank you. Um, we're gonna talk a little. And
Yes, please.
I will monitor the questions as well and just try to segue between mine and others. I'll make sure I'll prioritize fitting in everyone's questions rather than my own. So I won't just doggedly persist in answering, because I can ask you that another time, you know, things that I still have paper. But I wanted to begin by asking you quickly, because this is something I always wish that I could ask authors about. I wanted to ask about the epigraphs at the beginning. What two beautiful and concise epigraphs, one from the great poet Denise Riley and one from the great singer-songwriter Bill Callahan. And Riley's goes, what does the hard look do to what it sees? Pull beauty out of it or stare it in? And Bill Callahan's one goes, well, I used to be sort of blind, now I can sort of see. And the two, I mean, I think this is a particularly good example of two epigraphs juxtaposed that work so well together as well. But I wanted to just ask you about them, like where you came across those, and whether, I suppose, if they're both sort of artists that you've felt some affinity with in the past, but what particularly about those statements felt like they lead us into the book, or were just on your mind during the composition of these poems?
Well, thanks for flagging those. I'm so fond of both of those lines. You know, Bill Callahan's music is something I've been listening to for a long time, and in a way, he's been a bit of a soundtrack to the writing of this book. You know, he's a really important musician, and I think he's a really incredible lyricist for lots of reasons that I won't go into now. But what both of those epigraphs have in common, I think, is a theme that recurs throughout the book, which regards some idea of attention and what it means to pay attention to things. Whether that's to the world or to a painting or to the process of writing a poem or to what you're thinking and feeling in a given moment. And I'm really interested in that idea of attentiveness and what that practice actually entails. And when you really challenge yourself to see something and pay close attention to it, what you think you're actually doing and whether or not that's the same thing as what you're managing to achieve. So I think, to take both the epigraphs together, they both speak for me to some act of careful looking and attention, which I find really valuable. Riley's a poet who I really value, and it was such a gift to be reading her selected poems really quite close to the beginning of the composition of this book, and for those lines just to be there, kind of almost waiting for me. And I thought, wow, that's exactly what I've been trying to articulate in some of these poems. So it was almost a kind of too good to be true moment. So yeah, I think they have to do with like attention, and I'm just so grateful that they work together to introduce some of what the poems are about. Yeah, and everyone should listen to Bill Callahan's music and read more Denise Riley. That's true.
Yeah, we should put together a symposium on Bill Callahan and smog.
Why not? That's a good idea.
That'll be a
Yeah.
fun thing, I reckon. The staring beauty in really stuck with me. And also I think the both of them are sort of have a kind of aphoristic quality as phrases, and they're almost, I mean, they're like kind of serious jokes in a way. So the sort of understatement in Callahan, I used to be sort of blind, now I can sort of see, is kind of like it's funny, but it's also sort of more deeply honest than
Mm.
the lyrics to Amazing Grace that he's riffing on, right? It's kind
Yeah.
of like neither of these things is completely true. They're both sort of true. They're both an approximation of something. And there is that kind of, I think there's a sort of meticulous honesty in this book, in near life experience, that goes with the attentiveness, that is
Mm.
a kind of accuracy and meticulousness when it comes to the imagination and to thought, as well as the careful observation. It's not giving us the idealized response. It's not giving us the idealized thought. It's going with what really thought feels like and what it's like. It tries to capture that. I think that's not a
Well,
question.
well, I'm really interested in some idea of imperfection. And Wallace Stevens, who I was just reading a poem of his the other day, and he has this great line about our world being imperfection, and that imperfection actually, whether we like it or not, or whether we care to admit it, we do experience the world kind of imperfectly, or as you were saying kindly at the beginning in your introduction, a kind of sense of ourselves filtering the world as it comes through to us, which necessarily involves some process of augmenting it or shifting it or getting it wrong.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm really drawn to Bill Callahan's sort ofness in that sense, that it seems both like an honest admission of what actually happens or takes place when we're out and about collecting data, but also, yeah, there is a melancholiness to it of I wish there was a kind of sense of a way of getting to things as themselves, or being able to kind of access the thing as it is on its own terms, rather than us getting it wrong or changing it somehow or missing something.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
is true.
Yeah. But it is, I think it's in that sort of missing, it's in what's missing, and it's in the kind of, I guess that's partly what analogy is for.
Yeah,
We can never
and
say
you, you and
exactly.
I, you and I have worked. I mean, part of my PhD research project, as you know, concerns D.H. Lawrence and his poetry, and he's really interested in some idea of. He keeps talking about making contact with the world. He writes very often in the poems and essays about really wanting to find a way of making contact with the world, and butting up against it and meeting the world on its own terms rather than getting it wrong. And if you read the poems in a collection of his, like Birds, Beasts, and Flowers, which turned 100 last year, he's constantly coming into contact with these animals, and the poems are almost his attempt of trying to understand what it is that those things really are, and how you might transcribe them or get to them or their essence in a poem. And I mean, similarly to Callahan, maybe Lawrence's poems are often a transcript of his inability to do that.
Yeah.
But what's left is also kind of interesting to me. What you do manage to put down
Yeah.
has a lot of value or intrigue. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that sort of speaks to the um, Ben Lerner's ideas in The Hatred of Poetry, of just every
Mm,
every poem is just a or the Tenacious D song tribute, where it's they can't remember the perfect song
yeah.
to beat the devil, so they have to write a song about writing that song.
Mm,
There's but there are, I think, also in this is, to me, feels like, as well as just it's a celebratory and joyful book, but
mm,
it's a serious book as well. It asks big questions about ontology. It asks big questions about being alive, about being in the world. It
mm.
says these sort of declarations of being, and also of uncertainty, of constant change, and of shifting. Um, this is maybe quite a personal question to me, but
Mm.
it's the questions are asked quite unflinchingly. Like, you just go into that place, and you don't do that thing which I suppose I always fall back on whenever I'm writing, whenever I'm speaking, even, which I think sort of some of the sort of New York school poets do, which is that kind of undercutting, undermining. It's a maneuver that I really like, but it's not quite a wink to camera. I'm not really being serious,
Mm.
but it's often like juxtaposing quite a lyrical line with an extremely crude or demotic line, or it's juxtaposing something quite deep with something extremely silly. And it's this it's a kind of get out clause in a way. It's a kind of, it's like just in case you were taking me too seriously, or just in case you were going to take me at face value. There's this kind of sleight of hand that goes on there. I'm drifting a little bit, but you really don't do that here, and you did it quite beautifully in a few interiors. I think if that's sort of fair to say. It's and these aren't tricks, but they are kind of effects of poetry and effects of not anti-poetry, but turning poetry against itself sometimes. And there's, for me, there is, and this is something that I deeply admire, that doesn't happen so much in near life experience. There's still a questioning, and like in one of the poems that you just read, there's a kind of what kind of poet would say that line, which I love. But it's sort of that to me feels in service of something quite sincere, quite serious. So I guess the question I'm laboring towards gradually is like, how did it feel? And do you agree with me at all, or am I just absolutely just waffling on? But or what does it feel like to kind of put your neck on the line like that and write poems that are quite meditative and quite serious in that way?
Well, that's really generous of you, Luke. So thanks for saying that. And I think I agree with you that I do detect a bit of a shift between the poems in the first book and the second. And yeah, one hopes that you can put that down to, or chalk that up to, kind of getting over the anxiety of not wanting to put yourself too in the poems. There's definitely a few friends of mine who have read the poems in both collections in draft who have been banging away at me and saying, put more of yourself in here, stop doing that. But I think the best way to answer your question is really to return to something that I mentioned earlier, which is my admiration for poets who allow the process of questioning and asking questions and coming to the answers to be part of the process of what the poem is about or doing, and allowing the poem to be an environment or an arena where that process of thinking through things can take place. And, you know, if I think of some of the poets who I really admire, whether that's Elizabeth Bishop or, you know, even really the presiding spirit of this collection, who's the New York School poet James Schuyler, who is no longer with us, but who celebrated his centenary last year also. I think, you know, there's lots of poets who really allow the kind of drift of thinking and the drift of their thoughts and their workings out of things to be part of the poems. And I think that's something I've learned so much from. And yeah, I like to think that I wouldn't know what a poem wants to say before I sit down and start making it. And as I've said to you before and discussed with you, you know, the poems that you feel the most pleased about when they're done or when they feel done are those that you couldn't have predicted, or that have shown you something or revealed something to you in the process of writing them. I'm not sure if that answers your question. It's kind of related.
No, it does. Yeah, it does. No, yeah.
Yeah, so something like that maybe.
Good. The mentioning Schuyler and I think some others as well. This sort of it segues quite naturally into a question in correspondence that was received by email from Glenn in Hereford, which centers around notes and endnotes. And he asks, both of your Carcanet books have interesting endnotes. How do you decide what to acknowledge? The notes in your very enjoyable near-life experience mention Steinbeck, Eliot, and others, but not Auden, Dickinson, or Carlos Williams for his no ideas but in things. Maybe a few notes are fine, but too many are not. William Empson's complete poems contains 107 pages of poetry and 266 pages of endnotes. Are you tempted to go in this direction?
I'm reminded of, I'm sure it's Ashbury in an interview somewhere, who he says something really funny in response to a similar question about leaving something for the undergraduates to do by not including all the endnotes. That's such an interesting question, because actually I did take a great many things out of the endnotes of this book, thinking that it was kind of overkill. And I try and select endnotes that I think are going to be useful or kind of necessarily explanatory for something that might not kind of land or be obvious to a kind of reader. But I think there is a risk in over-explaining, and I think that poetry that starts over-explaining itself kind of risks losing something else. So I like to think that the notes in this book are almost like kind of curious doors that might lead the reader somewhere else, or to be able to engage with a poem in a slightly different way or go further into it, but also allow them to kind of wander off from the book and go and look at something else. I think all my favorite poetry is poetry that somehow signals to the world beyond itself or to things beyond itself. And
Yeah,
I'm happy if the notes do that a little bit.
that's good.
But I'll stay clear of the Empson stuff, I think.
Of Emerson's
Yeah, too
extreme
many.
indexing. Those, yeah, I think in tandem with his critical work, I think that was just in his nature to do
That's
that.
true. Yeah.
Beautiful book. Um, we've talked a little bit, started to sort of talk about painting. The book has this beautiful cover, which is sort of hold up to the camera. The full image is just at the bottom of the book, which is a painting by Mariotta Spens, Flight or Freeze, which is quite recent. It's 2020, I think. You have an essay on the Carcanet blog at the moment, which talks quite a lot about painting and quite deeply, which I encourage people to take a look at. We can post a link in the chat. You talk about a painting by Fayed, a painting called The Poet's Dream, which is quite a sort of almost sort of hysterical realist Victorian kind of painting of somebody just perhaps reading Milton, and the sky turning into chiaroscuro of angels and demons. And there's a passage from that I just wanted to quote back at you, if that's okay, because I really liked it. Anyway, what Fayed's painting communicates, to me at least, is that the contents of imagination produced by experience are part of the world too. As real and significant as any rocks or trees or water, we cannot help but experience the world through the augmenting prism of ourselves. Wales says, when I am in any place, I disturb the silence of heaven by the beating of my heart. And you've touched on this already, but we filter it through ourselves. We inevitably do, and even what we choose to write a poem about, right, is so inherent to our hearts and souls and minds, right? It says so much about us, what we focus on, what we read out, what we include. But that I really liked the line, the contents of the imagination being part of the world too, right? I feel like that sometimes gets neglected a little bit in a way. I don't know, or gets dismissed as kind of flights of fancy, right? When it is a universal experience.
I think that's true. I think that's true as well, and that is a useful thing to think about in conjunction to landscape painting in particular, but all kinds of painting. When you're looking at a painting, you're being invited not only to kind of view a version of the world that you kind of half recognize as real, but also it's kind of half imagined. But I'm sure we've all had an experience where we realize that something that we're looking at in what we take to be our real concrete world has kind of taken on the colors or the contours or the kind of feel or texture of something that's artistic. And without wishing to get too deep into kind of Oscar Wilde or Walter Pater territory, I think that is a really significant question that these poems are interested in. It's kind of like a feedback loop, I guess, that the world kind of triggers your imagination and how you think about the world, and then you kind of project that back outwards, and it affects or kind of alters how you experience the world the next time. So I'm definitely interested in writing about paintings and photography for that reason, that they give you, they invite you to see the world in the way that somebody else who isn't you has seen it, and that might inform or affect how you look at it next time. Probably also connects to our discussion about the epigraphs at the beginning of the book too.
It's that outward-looking thing again, I think, as well, which is sort of something that I think the book gives us as readers. Is this sort of it's such a sort of, and I think again it's in that accuracy about the inner life and the inner monologue and the inner doubts and uncertainties as well, and just which is quite well encapsulated by the sort of 20 simultaneous lines of the first thing in the morning and the first thoughts and the first kind of actions. Where was I going with that? Yeah, it's but that as well as that, it goes outwards. It points us to other sources. It invites us to compare and to read, which is, I think, the most pleasurable form of reading, is when you can have a pile of other things to refer to whilst you're working through the primary thing you're supposed to be reading. we've got about 8 minutes, and I've got a couple of questions in
Oh,
the
great.
Q&A. Please do add more if you have any. I'll check the chat as well in case any rogue questions have been asked there. We have a question from David Van Os. Rowland, it's exciting to hear these new poems. As in the first book, many feel drawn towards edge states or transition states. If that's roughly right, could you comment on how or why such states get your verbal juices flowing?
That's a good question. Thanks, David. I think that's true. I'm really interested in coastlines in particular, as a kind of meeting point, as I said, of two states. And I wonder if some of what we were just talking about with regard to poetry, painting, and photography, and maybe even poetry's relationship with reading other poetry, is kind of coming into contact with another territory or another landscape. There's a few different ways I could think about that question. Every time you write a poem, you start with a blank piece of paper. And so the very act of starting writing something feels a bit like entering a new territory or kind of crossing over into a different space. And I think that's maybe just a way of setting the kind of ground of writing, and it just always feels a little bit like that experience of crossing from one place to another. I think also, you know, when you think about a poem and how it moves across the page, there are so many small kind of transitions from one space or phase to another, whether that's just you know, one line break to another, or one stanza to another, or even just the kind of movement of syntax through a sentence. There's so much that's transitionary in the process of writing a poem. So I think you're really in that frame of mind in the process. But I think it's true that I'm also drawn to those states or those experiences, partly because a little bit like kind of tectonic plates rising through the earth, like something emerges when two things collide with each other. There's a kind of power or a kind of force that happens. So I wonder if that's the reason. That just seems like a very energetic or productive kind of way of thinking for me. So that might be an answer to the question, but I'd have to think more about that, I think.
A question from Royston. How did the title come about? Did you compose the collection with it in mind? Or was it afterwards?
The collection actually did originally have a different title, which I feel almost superstitious to reveal because it might prove to some readers to be a better title. I don't want to give that the opportunity. Near Life Experiences is the title of one of the poems in the collection. And with the help of my editor, John McAuliffe at Carcanet, it did just emerge as the poem whose title seemed best to kind of encapsulate some of the questioning that Luke has just been talking about and some of the kind of querying nature of the poem, as well as a sense of trying to get at what is real and what you can rely on and what you can be sure of. And you know that a lot of the speakers of the poems feel kind of unsure what their place is as part of their experience, and how they fit into their own world when they walk out into it. I think that's probably something that we've also all experienced a little bit of during the kind of pandemic years, of feeling as though the world is like withheld from you in some sense, that you can't quite access it in the same way. You're kind of adjacent to what used to be there or what you used to take for granted. So I think the title speaks to some of those things.
The beautiful question from Charlotte Crow, which we might end on. I think it'll probably take us towards 8 o'clock. Charlotte says, you describe these poems as places of collisions between two vantage points, the lyrical first person and a kind of plane's eye view, something approaching omnipotence. Can you speak more about that vantage from which a poem can see entire mountain ranges, the shelves of fossils hidden in cliff sides, that scale of landscape and of time? Whose eyes are these? How do you access them?
That's a typically generous question from from Charlotte, and as with David's question, there's a few ways that I feel I could answer that. The thing that comes to mind when I hear the question is that, in a sense, the omniscient view or the third person view is optimistic. I'm not sure how tangible or attainable it is. It's almost a kind of view to aspire to or to hope for that you might get at some point, that seems kind of more perfect or more valuable than the first person viewpoint that you have. And if only you could see things from a greater distance, that would be fantastic. You'd see, all the secrets of the world would be revealed for you in some sense. But in terms of accessing eyes, that's a question I think about often. And actually, some of the newer poems that are coming out that go beyond near life experience are very interested in accessing the eyes and perspectives of people who are very consciously not me, and speakers who are very, very much not myself. And I'm very drawn to some idea of what you might learn or what might be revealed to you if you see things differently or try to, in that sense. It's almost makes me think of putting on 3D glasses in the cinema, like those old red and blue 3D glasses. I don't think they have those anymore, actually. Yeah, you might see things differently, but the risk, I suppose it seems to tie that back to some things we've talked about already, the risk of seeing things differently is, I guess, a question of bias and seeing things actually incorrectly or getting things wrong. And yeah, the poetry seems a good space for me in thinking about accuracy and whether you can rely on what you're seeing being accurate or not. Maybe that is a good place to end. Yeah, thank you, Luke. I really enjoyed that. Really appreciate it.
Thanks everyone for your questions.
And thanks everybody for being here and for your lovely questions. Jazz.
Thank you, guys. Congratulations, Rowland. Oh,
Thank you.
It's launched. Thank you, Luke, and thank you, Rowland, and thank you guys for your lovely questions and your messages in the chat. I've put the link in the chat box for you. There's the discount code, so please do go and use the discount code. Please do buy a copy of the book from our website. It'll come as an email tomorrow as well, so you don't need to rush and do that right now. And if you have any problems getting hold of the book, please send me an email and I will help you. So I think that's everything. We're launching our next book on Zoom on the 17th of April. This is a debut collection from Rebecca Hurst. I've put the link in the chat for you as well, but you can sign up to our newsletter so you don't miss anything. But that's everything. So well done again, and thank you guys very much.